Like Anu, I'm also afraid of falling down. Um, I'd like to start by just thanking everyone who's spoken. I know I don't speak just for myself, but also for my mother and for Anna as well, when I say how deeply moved we are by all the tributes and all the insights as well that we've heard. It's very hard to speak today. It's difficult to figure out what to say, how to say it. It's impossible to strike the right balance between private grief and public tribute. I think I know what I would have wanted to say if I could. I would have liked to talk at length about my relationship with my father, or as I always knew him, just Sumit, to illuminate the person he was, to narrate anecdote after anecdote, some of them joyful, some of them hilarious, some of them sad, in order to demonstrate how much he meant, how much he means to me. But it's too soon. It's too soon to do this in public, and it may always be too soon. So I'm going to do something different to mark Sumit's passing in this public forum. I've chosen to bring together two apparently distant aspects of his life, which in reality are not so distant at all: his politics and his literary sensibilities and tastes, both of which I hope have left permanent traces in me. I'm going to do this by reading, in a while, you'll have to wait for it a bit, but by reading 5 poems by authors, by poets who were dear both to him and to me, and whose work we shared and discussed many times over the years. And I'll intersperse my reading of these poems with some remarks about what they mean or what they might have meant to him and what they might say about him. Now, I'm very aware that this is a reductive and inadequate way of talking about Sumit. It would be an inadequate way of talking about anybody. The things I'm going to say will not reflect Sumit as the whole person he was. But if I tried to do that, I either would not be able to go on because of the weight of it all, or I wouldn't be able to stop. So what I'll say now is all I can bring myself to say now. So politics first, always. The political tradition and experience that was dearest to Sumit and has been acknowledged as dearest to him was, of course, Marxism. He was, in a complex way, a lifelong Marxist. It lay at the core of his commitments, at the core of his sensibilities. But Marxism for him was never a single thing. It was also never a simple thing. He was always emphatic in his refusal of any description of Marxism as a science. Yeah, he had an almost aesthetic revulsion against that kind of description. And he was uneasy and skeptical also in thinking of it as a method. He would have considered these boxes into which this thing he loved so much, Marxism, was being shoehorned. He saw it rather as a many-sided, open-ended intellectual adventure, a commitment to social justice and compassion, and, as Rajiv so beautifully put it, a non-instrumental idea of sociabilities, and a complex, inspiring, but deeply tragic political history to reflect on, learn from, and criticize. Now, as I say this, I can imagine, what if Sumit was here right now, he'd be sort of smiling, but also looking rather quizzical, and he'd sort of in a twinkling way say, okay, those are nice words, but aren't those also boxes? Yeah, of course they are. From a precociously early age, I was introduced by both my parents to the richness, the plurality, the inner tensions of the 20th century Marxist tradition. And many of you have spoken very eloquently about how this was embodied in his work. His emotional attachment to this tradition lasted it outlasted his terrible accident in 2007, which slowly and painfully depleted him of so many of his capacities. Almost till the end of his life, he would speak passionately about the memory of this workers' struggle, this piece of communist poetry, or that rousing revolutionary slogan or song. In his declining years, Anna would very lovingly play him Paul Robeson's rendition of the great American labor movement song, Joe Hill, or he'd listen to songs from the Spanish Civil War, and tears would come into his eyes. Tears not of sorrow, but of joy and even pride. Pride at inhabiting this great and, if deeply ambiguous, political tradition. Of course, it wasn't just tears. There was also his twinkling humor. When he responded to artifacts of left culture, he loved a line from a song from an ironical song by the comedian Tom Lehrer, which I'll just quote here. "Remember the war against Franco. It's the kind where each of us belong. Though he may have won all the battles, we had all the good songs." I mean, I can't imagine a halfway honest leftist who doesn't have similarly ironical thoughts at least 5 times a day. Now, all these in different ways were marks of belonging to a common tradition, which he certainly thought of as a Marxist tradition. But this was not all. There was another side to this. In my early teens, he also introduced me absolutely unflinchingly to the other, darker side of the tradition he continued to cherish. And he talked to me of the doubts, very often and very openly, of the doubts and hesitations that attended his Marxism. After all, he had become a young communist following in his own father's footsteps at a time when uncritical adulation of the Soviet Union was universal, more or less, on the Indian left and across much of the Indian left, when being a Marxist more or less meant necessarily being a Stalinist. His world, the security of this world was rocked forever by the revelations made by Khrushchev in 1956, which made such a deep impression upon Sumit as a 17-year-old. He talked of it often. Later in life, he would acknowledge that these revelations, searing as they were, did not even graze the surface of the innumerable crimes of the state socialism of the 20th century, the harvest of corpses sacrificed upon its altar, the indescribable cruelties perpetuated in his name. He very strongly encouraged me to read George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, an indictment of Stalinism, which he also considered the greatest work on the Spanish Civil War. And even more urgently, he pressed me to read Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, which he considered perhaps the definitive novel on the Soviet 1930s. At the same time, he spoke generously and enthusiastically many times over the decades about the cultures of radical politics that could loosely be described as the New Left. E.P. Thompson, as everyone who has read Sumit will know, embodied for him the very best of what he thought of as the socialist tradition. Until almost the end of his days, he spoke of the extraordinary excitement he felt, again, as a young man during the Prague Spring of 1968. And to quote him verbatim, he often described this as really the last chance that socialism had. And he spoke of his bitterness about the brutal way in which it was crushed. Indeed, I mean, I'm very certain that all of this very deeply shaped Sumit's intellectual trajectory. You know, much is often said about his departure from subaltern studies and the reasons for it, and I don't in any way want to diminish the significance of this. It grounded his shift away from political histories in the received sense and towards the richly textured social histories that he developed in his later work, above all in writing social history, which I think he considered his finest work. But at least as significant, and to my mind at least rather more, were the impulses that led him to subaltern studies in the first place, and away from orthodox and doctrinaire declensions of Marxism. We often tend to think of this in purely academic and intellectual terms, as though it was simply an intellectual opposition to reductive frameworks that drove this sort of plural, open-ended Marxism. But I strongly believe that the inner moral and political tensions of the Marxist tradition in its entirety, as he experienced them and as I've just tried to describe his sense of them, were really the key factor. His journey as a Marxist was, I think, inseparable from his growing distance from the traditions of state socialism, which, whether we like it or not, constituted the dominant and most influential version of Marxism by far through the 20th century. But I'm not going to belabor this here. The point I'm getting at is that Sumit could hold these tensions in balance. He could affirm the grandeur, the heroism, the sacrifices, the achievements that define so much of the history of Marxism, while ceaselessly thinking about the immense darkness that shadowed it. Equally, he could acknowledge all the horrors without ever abandoning the tradition itself. In all honesty, this is an enormously difficult balance to strike, and it says something about him that he was able to do so without ever diminishing either one side or the other, without relapsing into convenient or consolatory answers to these truly terrible, terrible questions. I confess that insofar as I bear any part of his intellectual and moral inheritance, I find it hard, even impossible, to maintain this balance. For me, the revulsions and hesitations often overwhelm the affirmation, and the anti-Stalinism I learned from Sumit and later developed further on my own often outweighs whatever Marxism I have, though I perhaps still have some. Be that as it may, right now it is Sumit as a Marxist, the believer in radical egalitarianism, in subaltern social struggles, the critic of class power, of oppression and exploitation, whom I wish to remember in public. To this end, the first three poems I have chosen are by a poet whom we both love deeply, Bertolt Brecht, arguably the greatest communist poet of the 20th century. I begin with a poem that Sumit often used in his classes. I've been told this often by his former students. It's also, thanks to Sumit, the very first poem I have a conscious memory of reading and actually thinking about. I have no idea how old I was when I heard it, but old enough to grasp some of it, I think. I remember it was in Calcutta. It was this already rather faded bilingual translation of Brecht, which I'm sure lots of people in the audience also possess copies of this book. Brecht, A Worker Reads History. Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with names of kings. Was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? And Babylon, so many times destroyed. Who built the city up each time? In which of Lima's houses, that city glittering with gold, lived those who built it? In the evening when the Chinese wall was finished, where did the masons go? Imperial Rome is full of arcs of triumph. Who reared them up? Over whom did the Caesars triumph? Byzantium lives in song. Were all her dwellings palaces? And even in Atlantis of the legend, the night the seas rushed in, the drowning men still bellowed for their slaves. Young Alexander conquered India. He alone? Caesar beat the Gauls. Was there not even a cook in his army? Philip of Spain wept as his fleet was sunk and destroyed. Were there no other tears? Frederick the Great triumphed in the 7 Years' War. Who triumphed with him? Each page a victory. At whose expense the victory ball? Every 10 years, a great man. Who paid the piper? So many particulars, so many questions. I was determined not to say very much about Sumit as a historian. Others who have spoken today have done so much more articulately than I feel able to. But I will say that those last 2 sentences, so many particulars, so many questions, to my mind very amply sum up his practice as a historian. And it also just struck me, every 10 years a great man who paid the piper. I mean, what better way of looking at our country today? I'm tempted here to share an ironical and darkly amusing anecdote from my own experience as a teacher of history. Many years ago, I taught courses on labor history when I was a postdoc in Germany. And one of the very first times I did a class on workers' movements, I thought I'd quite consciously channel Sumit, and I'd use this poem. And so I very enthusiastically circulated it among my students. But as luck would have it, the only articulate and confident student in class that day, the only one willing to express his opinions loudly, was a passionate admirer of Mussolini. So let's just say that early experience of using a great revolutionary poem in class didn't exactly go according to plan. Much more seriously, the memory of this poem, which Sumit so loved, is linked in my mind to something that has happened very recently. Grassroots educational initiative based in Kolkata, a school for working class children in Bastis, has joined hands with a group that publishes history books for children, Itihasher Hatikori. They have instituted this amazing project that will enable working class teenagers to research and explore their own local histories. And they have named this project after Sumit. He was no respecter of persons, including himself. He hated veneration, but at the same time, nothing could have made him happier than this, and nothing could be a better tribute than this. Anyway, let me turn to the second Brecht poem that I want to read, which I think speaks for itself, although I will say something about it. A Bed for the Night. I hear that in New York, at the corner of 26th Street and Broadway, a man stands every evening during the winter months and gets beds for the homeless there by appealing to passers-by. It won't change the world. It won't improve relations among men. It will not shorten the age of exploitation. But a few men have a bed for the night. For a night, the wind is kept from them. The snow meant for them falls on the roadway. Don't put down the book on reading this, man. A few people have a bed for the night. For a night, the wind is kept from them. The snow meant for them falls on the roadway. But it won't change the world. It won't improve relations among men. It will not shorten the age of exploitation. In Sumit's declining years, I'd read this poem to him often, and although his memory and his capacity to absorb were on the wane, we still managed to discuss it on quite a few occasions. And I have a hazy memory of him commenting with great pleasure on the dialectical reversal in the last passage. You know, I mean, the second stanza ends with that kind of consolation. The snow meant for them falls on the roadway, which is, of course, very beautiful. But then, you know, it reverses, it flips it around completely. It will not shorten the age of exploitation. And I remember us discussing the fact that if the order of stanzas was reversed, you know, if the middle part came at the end and the end part in the middle, it would remain just as great a poem, but it would be a different sensibility. It would be contrary to Brecht's sensibilities. Now, the third and final Brecht poem that I want to place before you is not actually one that Sumit and I discussed. I don't even know if he read it. He must have. He read everything. It's a tiny poem, but it illuminates something else about Sumit's politics. Something much more unambiguous, much less internally fraught than his Marxism, something where there was no doubt, no hesitation, only unflinching certitude and unflinching courage and commitment. And I refer, of course, to the anti-fascism in the very fullest sense of the word that preoccupied him most from the 1990s onwards. So in order to contextualize this poem for Sumit, I need to tell a slightly complicated and painful story. He suffered a medical collapse in April this year, and he was hospitalized. And he returned home after 3 weeks in the ICU. But he was no longer capable of extended conversation or engagement. However much Anna and my mother and I tried to hope against hope, it was clear that he didn't have very long left. And during this period, I remember reflecting many times with immense sorrow and anger, and above all with immense bitterness on one thing among others, that he was dying in this political climate, in this horrible political climate which seemed so utterly barren, so utterly devoid of any hope, any dignity, anything human, anything but utter ugliness and cruelty wherever you look in most parts of the world, but especially here. In July, he entered his final cycle, and I'm not going to impose the burden of describing that upon your ears. But while the experience was shattering for us, the external context was now radically different. And I'm referring, of course, to the CJP movement, to the extraordinary, brave, witty, irreverent, youthful movement that spread outwards from central Delhi, perplexed those who sought and seek to crush it, and took the country by storm. Sumit by then was back in the ICU, in no state to speak, perhaps in no state to actually absorb anything or even think. We have no way of knowing what kind of consciousness he still had. The doctors couldn't tell us. But when I stood by his bed in the ICU, every day I'd tell him about this beautiful and stunning carnival of democracy unfolding before our eyes in the face of such desperate odds. Sometimes he twitched his face. I don't know if it was conscious, but I'd like to think that it was a conscious gesture. Now that movement, of course, continues in the face of heavy odds. It also suffers ferocious pushback, slander, repression. But at the same time, there are cracks which are visible in a way that one had never thought before. And the forces of oppression, to use a euphemism, have looked worried and strained in a way wholly unfamiliar both to them and to us, whether one thinks of certain rather comical, unintentionally comical Instagram reels, or whether one thinks of, the purge of the social media dictatorship that was, So to this end, I'm going to read the third and the last of the Brecht poems I selected. The last line for me says it all, so pay particular attention to the last line. Had Sumit been here still, he would have so loved this movement, so hated the forces deployed against it, had such contempt for the methods that have been used to sort of slander it and repress it. And he would so intensely have responded to the last bit of this poem. It's called The Mask of Evil. On my wall hangs a Japanese carving, the mask of an evil demon, decorated with gold lacquer. Sympathetically, I observe the swollen veins on the forehead, indicating what a strain it is to be evil. So, no comment needed, I think. I don't want to give anybody, however, the impression that Sumit's love of poetry, or indeed of art, aesthetics, beauty, was in any sense confined by his left-wing politics. So by way of conclusion, I want to turn to two great modern poets who could not be more different from Brecht. Indeed, both were very emphatically poets from the right of the political spectrum, but who were every bit as dear to him as any socialist poet was, actually more. The two poets I refer to are the great modernists, T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats. And I'll begin with not a whole poem, but a passage from an Eliot poem that Sumit very greatly loved, the early piece Gerontian. And this too, I think, he may have spoken about in class. So here we go from Gerontian. Think now. History has many cunning passages, contrived corridors and issues, deceives with whispering ambitions, guides us by vanities. Think now. She gives when our attention is distracted, and what she gives with such supple confusions that the giving famishes the craving. Gives too late what's not believed in or is still believed, in memory only, reconsidered passion. Gives too soon into weak hands what's thought can be dispensed with till the refusal propagates a fear. Think, neither fear nor courage saves us. Unnatural vices are fathered by our heroism. Virtues are forced upon us by our impudent crimes. These tears are shaken from the wrath-bearing tree. I don't recall how old I was when he first read this passage to me, but I do know it was deeply intertwined with Sumit's sense of what history is, its twists and turns, its reversals, its unintended consequences, its endless irony. Indeed, when I think of the phrase unnatural vices are fathered by our heroism, I think that these lines corresponded deeply to Sumit's sense of dialectics and even to his sense of the history of socialism. Anyway, I've probably gone on more than long enough, so I'd just like to conclude with a poem by Yeats. Yeats, in a sense, has been a poet for 3 generations of the family. He was really, Sumit's father was a contemporary of Yeats and read him and loved him and passed that love on to Sumit. And from the other side of my family, my grandparents and then my mother were also lovers of Yeats. So I suppose I had no choice. Unlike all the other poems I've read, it's got nothing really to do with politics. It's which is probably appropriate because, I mean, while this has been about politics, Sumit's life was not exhausted by politics. This poem's a meditation on what it means to be at peace, I suppose. It's not a poem about death, it's a poem about peace. But of course, I mean, we'll read it through our own prisms today. I can't quite explain why I think it's appropriate to end with it, at least not without plunging into a long and convoluted discourse, but I do think it's appropriate. So I'll just read it and stop there. It's called the Lake Isle of Innisfree, a small island in Ireland. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin built there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honeybee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day. I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore, while I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's grey. I hear it in the deep heart's core. Thank you.